The 1950s started out with the Cold War in North Korea. The U.S. was fighting to stop the spread of communism. The president at that time was Harry S. Truman. Truman wanted to limit the war to just Korea because he feared the consequences of nuclear conflict in Asia. General MacArthur, who was in command of the United Nations and American forces in Korea and Japan, insisted that U.S. seize the opportunity to defeat communist China. Truman eventually removed MacArthur from office in April 1951 because he lost confidence in him to follow his instructions on limiting war. Truman had also desegregated the military with Executive Order No. 9981 in 1948, but in 1950 lots of African Americans still served in segregated units. When troops had shortages, though, they would fill the white casualties with African American troops. The American military was largely integrated by the end of the war, but the military wasn't the only thing desegregating.
Even if some Americans in the 1950s still believed that a little learning goes a long way, they became concerned during the decade that it took more than a little learning to face the challenges of the day. Racial problems, McCarthyism, the Cold War, and budget shortages all affected the world of education. The notion of education itself became more than the traditional training of reading, writing, and arithmetic for children. The school and cultural events of the decade had an immense impact on the way in which Americans defined education. Who should be trained to teach students? How should teachers perform their jobs? And the goals of education were all questions the country asked. School enrollments increased 30% over the decade as the baby boomers, born after World War II, came of age. Increases of more than 1.5 million elementary and secondary school students occurred in 1952, 53, 55, and 58. 10 straight years of increased enrollment strained the physical capacity of aging school buildings and challenged the flexibility of outmoded curricula. As the flood of children ages 5 to 17 entered the country's school systems over the course of the decade, shortages in teachers and school resources led to frantic attempts to meet the demand. The biggest event in education during the 1950s was the desegregation of the country's public schools. The highly publicized legal case, Brown versus the Board of Education, which reached the United States Supreme Court, not only declared segregation unconstitutional in schools, but prompted measures to end discrimination in other public institutions. The court's decision in 1954 changed the course of education for states, educators, and most important, America's students. Black families who had been forced to send their children to generally poor-funded, black-only schools could now legally demand that their children be able to attend the same schools as white students. This ruling came under heavy fire as the country wrestled with integration. However, states mostly in the South were slow to integrate their schools, and full desegregation took more than 20 years. Religion in the classroom remained commonplace throughout the 1950s. Daily readings from the Bible and religious instruction of some sort continued to be part of the public school curricula. However, as the debate over funding and the separation of church and state intensified, states began to question the appropriateness of biblical instruction in public schools. In 1959, Pennsylvania outlawed Bible reading in public classrooms, foreshadowing the movement away from religious education in public schools in subsequent decades.
On July 7, 1953, an armistice between the United Nations and Communist forces was signed, ending the fighting. During the war, we helped the French out, giving them over $1 billion between 1950 and 1954 to combat Ho Chi Minh's Communist Army. In 1952, Truman announced that he was not running for president. He hoped that Democrats would allow Aldy E. Stevenson to be their nominee. The Republican nominee was Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower was a professional soldier, and his leadership in the successful D-Day invasion in World War II made him a national hero. Eisenhower was elected as president despite the critics who said he was a great general but a bumbling politician. Eisenhower was one of the most popular presidents of the 20th century. People often remember his years as the happy year because they weren't worried about the Depression or war. Instead, they spent their time enjoying the booming economy.
In 1950, a single dollar was amounted to $2.89. Every year, the income tax was increasing. We were requesting more money, and people were buying more and more of what they didn't need and couldn't afford. Unemployment was also increasing. For instance, gas was escalating as the years went on because more families were buying cars and needing to drive every day to the store and work. At the end of 1950s, gas had reached about 30.4 cents a gallon, which to us today seems like absolutely nothing. But back then, that was insane enough to where people didn't even want to drive places anymore. On average, a family's salary was about $4,000 per year. This decade was a decade of buying, always getting whatever was new even when you knew you couldn't afford it.
Eisenhower ran again in 1956 against the same candidate and was re-elected. During the time he was in office, 80% of the bills he sent to Congress passed. He worked closely with the House Speaker Sam Rayburn and Senate Leader Lyndon Johnson. When Eisenhower was first elected, one of the issues the nation was facing was McCarthyism. Senator Joseph McCarthy's campaign strategy was saying he had a list of 205 communists who worked in the State Department. This gave a huge boost to his political career, and he began going around making false accusations.
Agency of the
When
federal
McCarthy
government
went after the
inquiring
United States'
into their
highest-ranking
actions,
military
not
officer as
as
Army
United
Chief of Staff
Nations
during World
members,
War II,
not to
General George
that
C.
they are
Marshall,
not
people
suitable
were beginning to
persons
see his
to
campaign
be
was
in the
all
Secretariat
lies.
of the United
Eisenhower
Nations.
took
Now,
this
sir, to
offensively
clarify
because
just
Marshall
a
was
bit,
his good friend.
many of our viewers, I'm
But
sure,
Eisenhower never
feel that
stepped
your
in to stop
committee
it.
is deliberately
McCarthy
correct
carried
in
on
the
for
uni-
2 more years, ruining the careers of hundreds of Americans and making a mockery of traditional American values.
The 1950s was a time of fear. One of the biggest fears was communism. This fear worked into American lives from politics to press and media. The fear of communism in the 1950s was impacted by Americans' involvement in foreign affairs. The U.S. first started participating in the Cold War on June 24th. They feared that the invasion of communism and the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957. It worried the Americans because they were able to have a successful space program while Americans' efforts failed. The advanced technology of the Soviet Union had the U.S. concerned as that meant they were unable to stop Sputnik. Another great fear of the 1950s was the fear of nuclear arms threatened by foreign countries. The fear of nuclear arms was so big that the people would pay to know how to survive if there was a nuclear attack. Even with the knowledge of survival of the nuclear attacks, they would still be harmed. The 1950s was filled with nuclear bomb tests, and the Americans believed that they would end up being attacked by nuclear weapons. The 1950s was an era filled with the fear of communism and nuclear arms threat from foreign countries.
Having the civil rights of citizens to political and social freedom and equality is having your civil rights. In the 1950s, there were riots and outrages and wars just to grant someone of racial or ethnical difference their civil rights. In 1955, there was the murder of Emmett Till because he had flirted with a white woman. There was the Montgomery bus boycott that started on December 5th when Rosa Parks, an African-American woman, would not give up her seat for a white man on the bus. In 1957, we had the Little Rock Nine African-American children going to a now desegregated school. There was hate and violence all over. All of the parents of the white children were furious. There were sit-ins in every diner in town, African-Americans silently protesting that they wouldn't leave until they were served their food just like any white folk would be. But yet in all the mess from 1955 to 1965, there was hope for mothers. Some black and white folk were working together to make a movement. They were trying to end segregation in America. Martin Luther King Jr., an amazing man, gave his now very famously known "I Have a Dream" speech. The people were so moved they wanted to join the march to the nation's capital. Our nation was slowly progressing toward every man or woman, black or white, religious or not, we were all going to be equal.
In the 1950s, there were a lot of set social roles. Women were supposed to stay in the house and cook and clean. Children were supposed to go to school and do what their father told them. And men were supposed to go out and be the breadwinners for their families, as it had been for many years prior. However, due to the civil rights movement, many people felt they were being stifled in their current situation, and so they felt the need to rebel a little. In years to come, women and children would fight for their rights in a larger scale, but the 50s was the very beginning.
Desi Arnaz Show, I Love Lucy.
Okay, boys, hold it. Hold it. Hey, kids, come back. Push that heart out of the way, will you? We have an important story
BBC
to tell.
begins a new program called Today, and if it doesn't sound too revolutionary, I really believe it begins a new kind of television. This is in no sense a studio. This is really a working news center. The news.
Gunsmoke, starring James Arness as Matt Dillon.
When you were young, you had your own set of values. Values that nothing could change. An ice cream cone was a snow-capped mountain of sheer delight. An autographed baseball was more precious than rubies. And a note from the teacher meant only one thing: disaster. And that's our story tonight on Leave It to Beaver.
No, that's not our dog. Ours was a talking dog.
To be a talking dog? That's silly. If he could talk, I'd keep him myself.
Well, fat boy, you got yourself a dog.
Keep moving, 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 though they're disapproving. Keep them doggies moving right. Don't try to understand them, just rope, throw, and brand. Soon we'll be living high and wide. When the clock strikes 2, 3, and 4, if the band goes down, we'll yell for more. We're gonna rock around, rock the night. We're gonna rock, rock, rock till broad daylight. Gonna rock around the clock tonight. Good night.
Kool-Aid, a 5-cent package makes 2 quarts of Kool-Aid, Kool-Aid, 9 great flavors, the drink you love. Kool-Aid, Kool-Aid,
for the very best drink you ever made.
Kool-Aid, Kool-Aid,
Be sure that the envelope says Kool-Aid.
Barbie, you're beautiful. You make me feel my Barbie doll is really real. Barbie's small and so petite. Her clothes and figure look so neat. Her dancing outfit rings the bell. At parties she will cast a spell.
Hey, isn't watching TV fun? Especially when you got delicious McDonald's hamburgers.
Ronald, you can't be on TV and watch it at the same time. Now, come on and meet the boys and girls.
Oh, we've already met. I know we're going to be friends, too, because I like to do everything boys and girls like to do. Especially when it comes to eating those delicious McDonald's hamburgers. A magic tray here keeps me well supplied. McDonald's hamburgers, French fries, and milkshakes. Watch for me on TV. We'll have lots of fun.
The video cassette recorder was invented in 1956. Mainly television networks used this at the time because people could not afford it. Throughout the 1980s and the 1990s, the video cassette recorder was popular, but not in the 2000s. The DVD became more popular. Diners Club introduced credit cards in 1950. The credit card is a plastic card that takes away need to carry cash. You swipe the card from a machine to register what you have bought to pay for it later. The cardiac pacemaker was invented in 1950. The first device was too big to put inside a body, so it was an external pacemaker. A pacemaker today is a small device that is put into someone's chest to help them regulate their heartbeat.
The 1950s was a time of changes, and the music of the decade both reflected the cultural changes that were happening while still holding on to the societal norms of the past. Racial tensions were being strained with the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement, and music reflected many of those tensions. Rhythm and blues, also known as R&B, and rock and roll popularized black music, and many African American musicians rose to prominence and enjoyed success. But while some were able to reap the benefits of their work, many others were forgotten or denied access to audiences through segregation. A lot of people believe that during the 1950s, many of the white artists stole music from African Americans and capitalized on it for their own benefit in a way that the original artists could not. Others believe that the popularization of R&B and rock and roll only helped to bridge the gap between blacks and whites and further the civil rights movement. While those genres paved the way for future music, traditional pop music and country music clung to the past, with old standards remaining popular and a multitude of covers topping the charts. Elvis Presley was a huge influence in the 1950s and was thought of by most as the king of rock and roll. People say that he played a big role in the teenage rebellion during the 50s. The pop music in the 50s was also still a hit, and it was known for simple melodies and catchy lyrics. Country music kept its place in the 50s, and this genre was mainly influenced by Johnny Cash and Hank Williams. R&B emerged from the jazz music of the 1940s. This genre led the way for other genres such as Motown and funk music. The top 10 songs in the 1950s included Love Me Tender by Elvis Presley.
Love me tender, love me true, all my dreams fulfill. For my darling, I love you, and I always will.
Rock Around the Clock by Bill Haley and His Comets.
1, 2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, rock. 5, 6, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, rock. 9, 10, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, rock. We're gonna rock around the clock tonight.
Johnny B. Good by Chuck Berry.
Go, Johnny, go, go. Go, Johnny, go, go. Go, Johnny, go, go. Go, Johnny, go, go. Johnny be good.
Jailhouse Rock by Elvis Presley.
Walking through a party in the county jail. The prison band was there and they began to wail.
Blueberry Hill by Fats Domino.
I found my thrill on Blueberry Hill.
I've Got You Under My Skin by Frank Sinatra.
I've got you under my skin. I've got you deep in the heart of me.
When I Fall in Love by Nat King Cole.
When I fall in love, it will be forever, or I'll never fall in love.
Mr. Sandman by the Chordettes.
Mr. Sandman, bring me a dream. Make him the cutest that I've ever seen.
Hound Dog by Elvis Presley.
You ain't nothing but a hound dog, you're crying all the time. You ain't nothing but a hound dog, crying all the time.
Only You and You Alone by the Platters.
Only you can do
And that does it for the top 10 songs of the 1950s.
In the 1950s, one of the most important Supreme Court cases was the case of espionage between Claus Fawkes David Greenglass and his in-laws and sister, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Espionage is spying for other country, which in this case they were all involved in espionage for selling or giving information to the Soviet Union about building the atomic bomb or newer technologies. Klaus Fawkes was a scientist working on top secret information about the atomic bomb of Manhattan Project. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were a married couple and was espionage accused as spies that were exposed by Klaus Fawkes. David Greenglass was also involved in espionage, and he testified against the Rosenberg. They were executed in 1953, and as a sentence for David Greenglass, he was given 10 years in prison, and Klaus Fawkes also spent 10 years in prison. People thought that the Rosenbergs were innocent and they shouldn't have been executed.